This session is about the Global South. The Global South, which is, in a way, something that we need to question. What does it mean, Global South? If we talk about capitalism, it's the same, the United Arab Emirates and Zimbabwe. If we talk about imperialism, is it about the colonized countries and non-colonized countries? But then what about the US, which was in a way colonized as they were the Latin American countries, or Australia? If we talk about the many different senses of development, low-income countries, high-income countries, what does it mean in terms? Who is in the Global South? What are the visions of the Global South? And the thing that we need to probably to frame here is the definition of Global South has a meaning when there is a definition of the Global North, because otherwise there's not a definition of the Global South without that. But what affects to the Global North? What's the Global North when we have discussed about the de-Americanization of so on? The relational, the foundational relation in between US and Europe seems to be broken. Seems, and right now we don't know, because in a way Europe has been orphaned right now by the fact that no longer having the defense of the US in terms of the fighting in between Russia and Ukraine and so on and so on. But be careful, because also in Europe there's a rising of the ultra-right movements and then the xenophobic senses and so on, which make us closer in a way. They are not yet in the Commission of the European Union, but they might be in the Commission of the European Union, governments that might be of the extreme right, and they can control the extreme right. So we don't know whether we are under a situation which is a kind of passage, or whether we have a window of opportunity. And here is what I think we should be talking about. So the idea that we will develop in this session is a discussion about how do you perceive your South, because there are many different South as there are many different Norths. And the only thing that I can think myself about, what makes us saying this Global South and Global North in a sense that more or less all we can understand, is again a difference in between us and them. So if we are the North, then you are not the North, which is a kind of a way of understanding that there is a division, that there is a shift there. So we will try to understand in this session what we will be talking about. I've thought that it would be good to start by Veronica, and then went to Ranjit, but we have changed among us how we will be starting. So this is a full democracy. They decided how to do it. So we will be starting precisely by Ranjit Hoskot. I don't know whether I pronounce your name okay, but Ranjit, it's okay. Hoscote, like in Spanish. It's an artist, it's a poet, it's an independent curator for art, and I think that you can, all of you, you can have his the thing that he does in your phone by putting his name, so I don't go longer on that. I prefer to understand about this Global South.
Raphael, thank you so much. And it's marvelous to be on this panel and to be thinking about this question. And as you were speaking, Raphael, it occurred to me that in the years when I was affiliated to a research institute in Utrecht called BARC, we had a long-running program called The Former West, which was based on the idea that after the Berlin Wall fell, when it did, and everybody in Europe was talking about the former East, it was also important to think about the West of Europe as the former West, because the fall of that wall had consequences on this side as well. And you can't really assume a sovereign position on the world as though you remain unchanged by what you see and how you act in the world. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how we map the Global South. So maybe the first part of what I'll do is a little bit of ground clearing, which is, I think, evident to all of us through our lived experience. But just to put it out there, because terms are slippery, and it's not always clear whether we're talking about the same thing. I've always been intrigued by the fact that the trajectory of this term begins with a very strange person, a musician, a theater maker, an activist, who also was part of SDS, the Students for a Democratic Society, which led the 1968 movements. He was called Carl Oglesby. And he used the term Global South in Georgetown will be delighted to hear, in a journal called Commonweal, which is published by, it's a liberal Catholic journal, which you all know well. So from Oglesby's point of view, the term Global South spoke to a place of oppression, of historic trauma, and he meant it to really refer to the asymmetries of dominance and continuing neocolonialism in the world as he saw it at that point. It was very, very interesting to think about how he was also looking at the long aftermath of the Second World War, a redistribution of resources. But he clearly saw it optimistically as a space of possible resistance. Then, of course, we're all familiar with the way in which that term gets used in United Nations, IMF discourse. It moves from being a space of resistance to being thought of in terms of a lack and deficit and economic asymmetry needing intervention, developmental intervention. We've all lived through this period when our countries were described as less developed countries, underdeveloped countries, developing countries, the third world, and so on and so forth. And to me, the great image of that whole discussion is Willy Brandt's report. He was Chancellor of West Germany. Some of you might remember his questionable conduct, but we'll leave that to one side. Brandt's contribution to this was something that he called the Brandt line, which exactly as you said, Raphael, divided the world according to its economic attainments, with the bizarre results that Japan, South Korea, New Zealand, and Australia were in the north, of course. And many of us were in the south. But that, again, I think that was probably a response to all the discussions of the 1970s. The 1973 Club of Rome report, the limits to growth, the OPEC oil crisis. I think these were very, very crucial themes which informed Brandt's desire to map this world. And the report was called North-South, a Program for Survival. And I think we need to think about that. Do we just survive? Can we flourish? I think these are important questions when we are conceptualizing the global south. I'm going to do a quick gear shift also, because you asked us, what does it mean to us? Really, when I think back to my university years, late 1980s, early 1990s, I'm just doing this in a memoiristic, intellectual biography kind of way. It really seemed to me that the global south was a site of potentially redemptive perspectives. Like Pankaj here and like some of us, I think I was really very much a child of the non-aligned movement. This idea that you could look within to your own countries, your own emerging societies for inspiration, not by appealing to some ancient tradition, but by really looking at the live and current intellectual debates of the moment. So, of course, to people like me, to our generation, it's very important to look to global north thinkers, if you will. In my case, particularly Gramsci, Wittgenstein, Levinas. But I also found inspiration really through friends in institutions like St. Xavier's College, a Jesuit institution, the Center for Education and Documentation, which is very informed by liberation theology. Three figures that I'm going to really mark off and leave you with those thoughts. To me, these represent the spirit of what it can mean to come from the global south and to think about these questions in the world. The first was Paulo Freire, who was very, very crucial to my generation because he offered this notion that the oppressed can develop a pedagogy, that pedagogy itself doesn't have to come from dominant establishments, but can come from below. This was very crucial. Ivan Illich, who came out of, they're all Catholics, by the way. Anthony, I'm looking at you. You look very happy. So Ivan Illich, you know his work, comes out of a Habsburg background, but was, I think, powerfully transformed by his work in Mexico, for instance, or his inspiration by Kumarappa, who was a Gandhian economist. So again, we are looking at these figures who ranged across the world seeking inspiration from other kinds of situations of crisis, other predicaments. And again, from Illich, I hold in mind a rather Levinasian image when he said, you have to seek the face of the God in the other. You know, there's this notion of encounter and of dialogue is very strong. The last global south figure for me is somebody who was born in Barcelona, I don't know if, I mean, his institution is not, say again? Raimon Panikkar, exactly, yeah. Who was, his father was Indian, mother was Catalan. And Panikkar was, from very early years, a source of great inspiration for me. Also because he was at the forefront, probably not as well known as he should have been, because he was caught up in a more theological context. But for instance, the ideas that he promoted of ecosophy, what is the wisdom of the world? Not the way in which humans impose a wisdom on the non-human world, but what might we learn from the non-human world? He was really quite a pioneer in that way of thinking about the environment. And with all of these figures, I think what comes across very, very strongly is the focus on being ecumenical, on being dialogic, on working across cultures and across religions, and which is why I think I certainly think we should go back to them. And a little caveat just before I finish. Bonaventura de Sousa Santos has called these epistemologies from the South, another thinker who's very crucial to me. But I just want to end with a caveat that there's a tendency when we think about these kinds of philosophers and philosophies to say that, these guys are all very well where they come from. We don't need to bother about this. We will continue in our post-Kantian world, whatever that might mean. I think it's very important to not exoticize these philosophies because they come from elsewhere. They are not trapped in their own predicaments. It's not like they have some purely local application. I would like to appeal for us to think about these and other thinkers as also having a claim to universal application. I think we could all, even if we're in the global north, I think there's a great deal to be learned from these positions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for sticking to the time that we have scheduled for this 5 minutes, and also a thing that then will be debated later, which is whether these other philosophies are considered culturally by Western as philosophies or are not. But now, taking the sense that you said on economic and cross-cultural, we will change into Spanish. So to see that there are other languages here that we can talk about. Vamos al castellano.
We will switch to Spanish now. Vladimir, he is a philosophist, musician. He works at a university. He's a professor. And his vision of the South also stems from what is the South from your point of view as a Brazilian person. You work in a region with the specific characteristics. It's not a poor country, not democratic, so they have their own point of view, right? First of all, I won't speak Portuñol. I'll try to speak Spanish. That's important. Thank you all. I like to start expressing an uneasiness about the Global South term. It's not a term that was the result of a self-understanding. It was the result of an internalization of an external perspective. Also because this term somehow turns off the history of another term, which is third world. I think there are important things in this third world idea. First of all, because it was the name that allowed the systematization of the connection of social fight among our countries. Secondly, because it described a sort of stationary condition of our countries. Temporary because it was linked to the idea of underdevelopment. So the idea is that it wasn't possible for us, underdeveloped country, to become developed, because that was the structural condition in global capitalism. And that meant, I think, a critical idea, which is very important, it is there's no space for us in this world. There's no place for these countries in this world, so somehow we should use this no place as a transformative powerhouse. So now we see the importance of trying to make this turn into the global south. Why do we need this turn, this shift? Not only for a moral purpose, to diverse our horizons in which we see the world, but it's a social important question in which, in crisis situations such as the one we're living today, the periphery of capitalism is the future of the whole system. So if we want to understand what's going to happen here in Europe, if we want to understand what's happening in the US, the first thing we need to do is to look at Argentina, India, Brazil, because these countries make it explicit, these structural contradictions of the global south, because they're countries that showed very clearly that there was a continuous shift between social modernization dynamics, processes of progress and violence, demands of growth, and destruction dynamics, as Marx would say. There's a process of productive forces that turn destructive into destructive forces. Something that I think is important if we look at the global south today is to understand how the response to this crisis that are important today is the brutalization, the social brutalization. That means a sort of social violence that has an outcome of the political idea that there is no society for everyone. These countries assimilated this, tragically assimilated this idea that there is no society, there is not a society for everyone. So it is crucial to organize social life from the circulation of a political effect, which is desensitization of indifference. So the key aspect here is how to build this new social body from a very deep desensitization movement. So today it's important because if we accept that our ecological crisis, social crisis, economical crisis, political crisis, psychic and epistemic, they are not stabilized. They should become a government system. This means we, in our horizon, global horizon, we have the idea that our societies need to be conceived as spaces for war, civil war, permanent civil war. It's very present right now in our country. And I think the result of this is that we should know how to fight against a process that is stronger by the day of social desensitization, and our countries are somehow global labs. If this global south was so touched by the Gaza's destiny, it was because we saw that in that territory was happening something that we knew: genocide, constitution of a country as a global laboratory that could be used regardless of the situation, generalized as a way of social management. I think that's the first thing I would like to say. Thank you. Thank you very much. Vladimir, precisely changing from this social lab to your neighbor country, Argentina, I think I'll give the floor to Veronica. Talking about cruelty, political cruelty towards the social. So now, Veronica from Argentina, you are a philosophist, politologist, activist, and she's written books that you may have at hand. For example, the Feminist International. You might know him. All of you that are students that are here present. Thank you very much, Rafael. Thank you to my colleagues in this panel and all of you that are here. It's a pleasure to talk about this matter today and here. So in Argentina, there's a strong resistance towards the idea of global south, precisely because of the way of international bodies have organized this category as a way of homogenization, and especially how, just like Vladimir mentioned, it worked as a concept that moves this period of Bandung. Where did this power come from for the anti-colonial forces and this third world perspective? So this third world dimension shows us a bigger problem, which is when the concepts are linked to specific fights, because then we've had, for example, very interesting interventions of Arturo Escobar, reviewing this third world term. Some speeches have organized the perspective of development as the only perspective, and they've reviewed the idea of a third world to progress horizon and temporality linked to a linearity of this progress, and then inevitability of the projects new extractivists in our region. So what seems interesting to me is to think from where these concepts gain power for the fight, and how there's an organism in an international level, here ONU, so at the UN, the IMF, they should refurbish these concepts of fight to find new keys and new grammars. So this is why I think it's interesting to think of the practical practices from where we are launching all this. What are we doing, and what fighting political memory we have in each political moment? So the activity here is, how do we automate this circulation of these concepts, and how do we talk about them when we try to reactivate and also captivate these concepts? And something else that is important to point out is, what are the concepts that talk about something in common when we talk about the third world, the global south, this perspective? The interesting part is, how do we reframe this in an international perspective, right? When in our countries, we have the basic dimension of coloniality. So how can we rethink this dimension outside the work frame of this national sovereignty, and thinking about other ways of sovereignty that are not propriety? So, for example, how do we conceive the fights for abortion without thinking of the body as a ownership? So there's a dimension that is key of how do we map or organize this dimension that gives a checkmate to propriety ownerships, and that does not abandon a pretension, vocation, internationalist perspective of the territories. So that connectivity that Vladimir was mentioning regarding the fight is something that we should take into account when producing new maps of the territories. We could call transborder fight dynamics that also challenge the global as an abstract territory. In that sense, I think that is key to go back to the idea that our Souths against this third world that is left behind and that one day will be developed. What arises is a new idea of what is going to be the capitalist idea of genocide authorities. So first is experimented on in our countries, producing these connections between tourism and new liberalism that will be generalized afterwards. And the type of violence that appears in our countries, it's a violence that can be that has an expanding capacity, but especially it can be disseminated, and it happens in our countries, and then it extends to other countries. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Veronica. And I think you hit the nail on the head when we talked about the order, because we went from the global to the more specific cases. And now, Yasnaya Elena, since we have a negative perspective when we talk about the global south, now I wanted to say, Yasnaya Elena, you come from a nation without a state and without a vocation of having it, and which is weird. And secondly, from these communities that many times we talk about things that tend to be globalizing, but they do not reflect the realities of your lives. I'm going to give you the floor. Thank you very much. Thank you for all these initiatives, people, for the chance of producing and making it possible to have this dialogue here, which I think is extremely valuable in this historical moment. So thank you very much. I'd like to start with some questions that I'd like to answer from my point of view, which is, what is the global south, the global north, the north of Europe? I grew up in a community where we talked in a language where I couldn't mention any of this, and throughout my life I've been classified in different ways. First of all, I was classified as Indigenous. First of all, I grew up in a place where the distinction was to be a Mije or not. Everybody that is here today are a god, and you just realized about this. And I realized about this in the first migration, and I had a heated debate because a woman that was Ainu, Indigenous in Japan, she was Indigenous just like me. Then I realized I belonged to the third world when I went to the US, and then now I belong to the global south. So I like this trip through tags and terms that I cannot translate into my language. It's complex, and that does not appear in the political assemblies. And that's why linguistic diversity is so valuable to me. So what is Europe, the global north? Are they synonymous? That's an interesting question. In the global north, or the vision that got to me is that it's not a geographical region. I do not conceive it as such, but to a thinking tradition that has practices and realities, and that has effect in all the people in the world, and especially beings that are alive or not in the planet. And this thinking tradition, I find it in the US, but also in the school that I attended, where we were taught that leaves, they taught us how to sing, like the leaves that fell in autumn. Or we were taught that universal history, it was the history of Europe, of course, and where we were taught that there was a fundamental division between culture and nature. And that division, I think it tells a lot about what has become of the global north and global south. I think it's a very key idea when defining global north and global south. This division that does not exist in our thinking methods, and that in me, in my language, I cannot speak of. The closest I have is it, which is a word that means everything that is and exists, which includes me, in which the relationship between nominalism and entities that are from the animal world, there's a continuum. And this vision of the Bible, where God gives Adam the power of constituting something else that is not in the natural world, and not Eva. So I think that this global north in my school is a tradition of thinking. And so this is why I find it very interesting here in Europe, the Montes Comunales in Galicia. I thought, whoa, here there's a global south, or there are hints of this global south, or in the Sami people in Norway. So when not only seeing the global north as an affair coded in countries or geography, but in a thinking tradition that has an effect in life and reality, I can see it in other places, and then also in these souths. That's the question in this panel, I guess. How can we turn into this global south? What would this imply? And I think because of the time that I have, I will talk about it later, but I'd like to talk about two main conditions to establish this dialogue. First of all, having a historical perspective of the global north. So capitalism, patriarchy are pillars of this thinking tradition. But maybe the global north was not always like this. And we should analyze why it happened so. In the indigenous groups, the global north is a threat that has had genocides done in our tribes, in our groups. But it's interesting to see where they are, to offer this tradition that is taking place. And then is the need of asking this thinking tradition to leave behind this aspect that I'd like to exemplify. Thank you, Jesnaya. I think we have four very clear positions. We have the diagnosis, what's happening in the South Global that shouldn't be called this way, that I understood from what you mentioned, the four of you. But we understand each other. And until we find this new term that allows us to refer to this side, are we facing an opportunity? Everything that you're suggesting is going to allow us to break with this tradition that is affecting us all in a political level, economical level. Do you see as an exit to this?
You are in minority in this table. I will give you the floor the sooner you say, I want to talk, but for the rest, en fin, la pregunta la lanzo.
The question is this an opportunity, or are we just where we were before? Maybe a way to talk about this question is saying, at least there's two ways of thinking universalism. There's a concentric way. For example, we have a stone that falls in a lake, and then you have all the waves around it, with a center, Europe, with their cultural contradictions, and the modelization processes that follow this center. But then another possibility would be to think of a resonant universalism. All social forms can create emancipation processes. If all social forms can create freedom and justice systems, the tensions of each social form finds different connections. For example, the contradictions from the modernization process in Europe, they could produce epistemics that are conflictive and that could recover experiences that were switched off and from other social forms, for example. We have a very interesting case in Brazil of an anthropologist that connected, Eduardo Bípedes de Castro is his name, a connection between the Amerindian thinking and so the French said, no, but the Brazilian Indians are like the people in the Quartier Latin. But I don't think that's the question. The question is that he found a resonance between alternative structures of understanding the world, and this resonance found a connection, lateral connection. Maybe we are talking about this possibility, this opportunity, this change to thinking this way. Maybe pulling this thread, one would be to have universalism as classification and appropriation. So it would be this resonance idea. What produces this connection between different fights? And I think this has always been the question and at the core of different fights in terms of learning. What can we learn from different fights instead of producing one model to export, one model from which producing classifications and hierarchy and a model from which we can organize the ways in which some fights and resistance are legitimate and others aren't. And we have to translate, again, not in a learning way, but classification and hierarchy way. So there's a key point here. And when we say that the Global South is being the lab of certain dynamics, I think that there is something brewing up in our territories, not from the cruelty perspective, but the dynamics that show that there's a critical response and vital response in which cruelty appears as the governmental machine. So it's important to show the sins in the Global South as the way of complete destruction, and also forget the ways that resistance has been showed towards this cruelty. I don't know if there's...
I could take that forward, actually, because I really respond strongly to these ideas of resonance and forms of criticality towards these experiences that come from very particular situations, but how do they then extend and make that claim to universality? So in this context, I'm just going to flag two things. Constantly in writing about ideas that come from elsewhere and looking at the fulcrum of Europe, I've constantly, like everybody else, I use the term Eurocentric. I realize there's a kind of a semiotic violence there. And in the last few months, literally, I've begun to replace Eurocentric with Euro-provincial. I mean, adapting Dipesh Chakravarti here. But to make the point that there is nothing sovereign about a perspective based here. There's a very provincial way of looking at the world. Forms of knowledge, forms of resistance have emerged from elsewhere. And again, something that's been very key for me is my guru in the visual arts world, who passed on too early, Okwe Anwezor, the extraordinary Nigerian-American curator. He would always talk about looking to the global off centers, So I think we really need to explore what seems tangential and eccentric if we're, well, not quite Barcelona, but if we're somewhere here in Europe. But we need to be aware that we have to translate this from what looks like locality, or, as you were saying, what looks like indigenous knowledge, we actually have to start renaming these things. They're not some special course to be taken on the side. They have to be brought into the mainstream of how all of us look at the world. It calls for a tremendous dismantling of what this sovereign self is. And I think that if you want to think about what a European subjectivity is, it's based on historic acts of repression, its own contents. Particularly, I'm always very aware of talking about this when I'm in Spain, with its own extraordinary 700-year history of actually belonging in an ecumeny that connected it to all kinds of other parts of the world, which is, even today you find people in English sometimes describing that as Moorish Spain, kind of an absurd word. I mean, you're looking here at an enormous and wonderful laboratory of confluence. Those, to me, are exemplars with all their conflicts and violence. They're also things that were made together across differences. And I think this is what we need to do today in terms of embracing other forms of knowledge.
Thank you. Jasna, I don't know si tú quieres comentar algo.
I don't know if you'd like to comment something from this. If you have questions, please do raise your hand, because we don't have much time. We have 15 minutes now. But if you have a question, please do raise your hand. Otherwise, look, we have a question here. I start there, and then I'll launch my questions. And don't worry, because this will continue. These debates have a long lifespan. Do we have a microphone here? Hi. First of all, thank you very much. I think it's very gratifying to hear you finally that the fact that the Global South term is problematic. It's a vague term and paternalistic, but sadly, it's still very present in the academic world and political world. So what's the next step? Should we rethink or redefine the concept, or even stop using it? Do we need that many tags? How can the institutions stop using this binary term? Could we start showing the real diversity of 125 countries that it entails? In the end of the day, are we doomed to using this sort of terms? Who wants to answer? I think there's something important, is this binary tendency. It's either this or that. But I'm gonna give you the floor, because you are the ones that should answer. Well, I think something important is precisely to not think of the Global South as countries, but to think in multiple responses. Our response is not one solidified answer. There are many answers. On the other side, there is a similar this debate within the Indigenous community for a while. In the collective that we worked, we said we are not Indigenous, we're Mije. However, we need to take something into account. If you stop mentioning oppression, it's not going to stop existing. So we could give it many names, but the relation, the asymmetric relationship that exists will continue existing. The thing is, how can we avoid for this to become a monolith? How can it be an essence and not a moment in history? Being in the Global South, it's not an essence. It's just a position, historical position for unfortunate events in the last century. And I think that could be the answer. And then it's multilingualism. So ways of talking about the otherness. There was a study of how was the otherness built, and I realized that the otherness is usually non-binary, and we lack names to name somebody that's different than me. somebody that lives up the hill because of the climate. So this binary distinction is stronger when we have problems talking about this otherness, especially in Indo-European languages. I don't know if any of you wanted to comment on this. In the feminism fight, you fight to avoid this binary point of view. There's no need to conceive the world in terms of development. First of all, because it's fake, and because it makes you think that the wealth is in one place and then poor societies are all in the south. But we could conceive the world in a different way. For example, the connections of social fights. So this can create new identity forms. This identity way of thinking of the world is wrong. We do have global north in our territories as well that are isolated from the social structure. So we should reconstitute this way of reflecting of these spaces.
To follow up what you said, Vladimir, I think we also need to get away from this way of thinking about the world, which is already compromised. We have to also, I think there's a slightly more radical gesture, which I think is, we're all hinting at it. We have to be able to de-link value from monetary value, from the kind of value that financialization imposes on us. And then to see what is it that we have that is of value and that resists monetary translation and inspires us to be more human, to seek our possibilities. I think that's at least one of the themes of this idea of what is the third world.
Hola, muchas gracias.
Hello, thank you very much. Just one detail that I find relevant in this moment. We've always discussed in the capitalism history the importance of creating territory in the global market. Today, there's a dynamization of this situation. How is the world? The national states have a different relationship, power relationship, with what they were back in the day. So these ideas of sovereignty, territorial sovereignty, linked to a nation has a different political view. Nowadays, there's a difference between the power of the global market and the concentration of the political power. And this reflects different violence dynamics in different territories. And I'm going to give you a specific example of how today ultra-right-wing powers are the power of this intensification of this territory production. And what is happening in favelas in Brazil the next day after the massacre in Rio de Janeiro is the order from the Argentina government of fortifying the borders of Argentina. So this new idea of the dangerous classes that now are called narco societies. So they do not respond to state logic. And this dynamization logic create this intelligence from the global market. So thank you all. This is highly interesting. Thank you, Yasnaya, for saying I belong to the global south from the Montes Gallegos. When they talk about Galicia, they think about the hegemony in Galicia. But I come from a communal hill, Monte Comunal, that is burning right now, that is being extracted from. And my question is very quick. Since this global south is also in Galicia, in Montes Comunales, there's epistemics that come from other social forms that I got to know since I was living in that village. Aren't we thinking too much from the urban standpoint, and we're forgetting this episteme, this ancient past, this ancient culture? I don't know. Since we have 3 questions and 6 minutes, I'm gonna take the 2 questions that we have left, and then we will have this urban rural question. And let's give the microphone there, and then there, and with that we will be done. Thank you. The question would be, can you be an optimist and thinking that universities, schools, high schools worldwide, not only in Barcelona, Metropolis, in New York, in Caracas, Buenos Aires, anywhere, could teach architecture, literature, even biology, at a local level, and not teach what the books from the north, the ideological north, have given us the knowledge to teach and convey to the south. Thank you. I think it is perfectly understood what you mean by this question. We're going to go to the third one and then move to the answers.
Would like to say that I have the privilege to be a scholar from both the Global South and Global North. And my question actually relates a little bit on epistemic justice. What message do you have for academics from the world, the global academia, so we can move beyond the deficit model when we have global research partnerships and, Global South is working with Global North and vice versa. So how do we move beyond that deficit model? Because I think that it could be really the leveraging point to create some change. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And
let's go now to the answers. I think one we can be linked to the other. Learning and how coloniality within investigation. And then we go to the first question, which is this power of urban versus rural and the loss of knowledge. Who wants to start?
Response. One is, thank you for the question about urban-rural divides. I think it's actually more complicated than that. What is called for is a questioning of our whole way of mapping North, South, and all of these differences. It's complicated by these differences, the urban, rural, and the peri-urban, but also by the fact of diaspora. There's a vast old-style third world presence in the old first world. So, our models have to correspond to these new bewilderments. We can't go on using these static maps from the 50s and 60s. Otherwise, we're not going to be able to bear witness to the struggles and conflicts of the struggle for equity today. Yeah, and also brief word on the North-South thing. I don't think that one form of dominance needs to be replaced by another. I think that's always a dangerous moment. If you want to bring about epistemic justice, that has to be done in a dialogic, incremental way, at least from my point of view. Keeping ideas in play and in debate, I think, not simply because that way, and I know it from our South Asian context, has also led to radical nativism, the complete opposition to anything that comes from an alleged outside, to be replaced by things that, then are not necessarily verifiable and are equally essentialist in their own problematic way.
I agree with Ranjit. Just to tackle the last 2 questions, there's a story that for me is quite interesting. When I was studying philosophy, I remember asking a professor, why don't we study Chinese philosophy, Hindu or Amerindian philosophy? And the professor said, because they do not exist. Because they only have myths, specific ethics, but not philosophy. And I think that maybe that's a very interesting strategy. If philosophy was a speech created to have the self-critic of our values, it's clear that every society has the capacity of self-reflection, and there's something similar in other societies. So we create unity, and there's another whole philosophy history that that makes us create these links, and we could create a way more interesting university. We only have 3 minutes because we sabotaged the. We were sabotaged by the previous session, so let's finish on time. Well, in order to answer this, something that I think is very important to thinking about epistemic justice is to leave behind the pretension of universality of the European tradition. One of the rights of this tradition is the right to name these other things. In this process, we've said it's not philosophy, and it is good that it is not so. We do not come from the Greeks. We do not work this way. And when they say it's very valuable that you, as Mijes, have self-fertilized corn, it's a model for the agro industry. And we say this is not science, and it's okay that it's not. We do not have a Nobel Prize. We do not have indexed magazines. We do not have universities. So what I would ask for this epistemic justice is that the Western world, they have these thinking models, and one of them is the philosophy, and it's in the F. There is patriarchal systemics, and they call it feminism, but not all movements are feminism. There are systems to convey knowledge. One of them is the science, and it's in the S letter. Okay. And if we understand all this, we can start having a different dialogue. And I'd like to add here that there's something coming from the fight to asking for something different. In Argentina, for the comprehensive sexual education that was asked from the schools, which is a very open curriculum, and they are constantly updated. And nowadays, this content is facing the economical education in schools. So there's a transversal view of the contents that are taught, but especially the way the economic teachings are closed by corporations. And sexual education is a series of questions that should be answered in the classroom. So there are different ways of thinking about these impacts and revising of these philosophies and debates in the programs, schools, and universities. Thank you very much. Thank you, the four of you. Thank you, Georgetown Global Dialogues, CCCV Bancage. For me, it's been a pleasure to have you all here, since even if I'm the only one, well, I shouldn't have been accepted here because I come from this dominant position to imposing this binary world. I hope you enjoyed and learned a lot from them, because it was really worth it. Thank you very much.